August 18, 1944. Texas sun burned over the endless plains like molten brass. The air shimmered above the dry earth, and even the cicadas seemed too tired to sing. At Camp Hearn, a sprawling German POW camp northwest of Houston, the day began like any other. Bugle at dawn, roll call, breakfast of powdered eggs and coffee substitute. Guards in khaki uniforms marched along the fences, their shadows long in the early light, while behind the barbed wire thousands of captured German soldiers stirred from their bunks. The camp was vast, more than 700 acres of Texas soil fenced with double rows of barbed wire and watchtowers at each corner. Inside, the Germans had built their own world. Barracks stood in neat rows, each filled with wooden bunks, crude stoves, and tiny makeshift decorations, drawings of home, postcards from Bremen or Munich, and carved wooden toys made during long idle hours. They grew vegetables in small garden patches, played soccer in the evenings, and staged plays or orchestras in a dusty recreation hall. But beneath that uneasy peace simmered restlessness, the ache of captivity, the sting of lost honor. Among the prisoners, Feldwebel Karl Bremer, a 32-year-old engineer from Bremen, felt it more sharply than most. Before the war, he'd worked at a shipyard designing torpedo housings. He wasn't a Nazi ideologue. He'd joined the Wehrmacht out of duty, not belief. Yet now, surrounded by endless miles of foreign land, he felt stripped of everything: rank, dignity, and purpose. The Americans were kind enough, but their kindness made it worse. Karl often sat under the pecan trees near the western fence, sketching escape routes in the dust with a stick. His comrades laughed at him at first. "Bremer," they'd say, "we're in the middle of Texas. Where would you go? Mexico is hundreds of miles away." He would only shrug. "Every fence has a weakness," he'd reply quietly. That summer, his idea found followers. Hans Kruger, a 24-year-old farmer's son from Bavaria, tall and broad-shouldered, longed for freedom and open fields. Otto Keller, once a Luftwaffe mechanic, joined them too, a quiet, gentle man with pale eyes and an instinct for machines. Together, the three began to study the camp's routines, guard rotations, supply trucks, patrol timings, even the angle of the sun that blinded the western watchtower during late afternoons. The camp commandant, Major Harold Turner, a fair but strict officer, often reminded his men that these POWs were not ordinary prisoners. "Treat them with respect," he'd say. "They fought for their country as we fight for ours. But never forget, they'd run if they could." And indeed, they could. The plan was simple, but daring. The men would volunteer for a work detail outside the wire, cutting timber and repairing fences on a ranch about 2 miles from camp. The American guards had grown relaxed. Many of the POWs had been model workers for months. There had been no major escape attempts in Texas since early 1943, and most believed the men were too far from civilization to dare. But Bremer had spent weeks preparing. He fashioned makeshift maps on scraps of cardboard using smuggled pencils. He'd overheard guards talking about small creeks and farm roads. He even learned a few words of English, enough to ask for water or help if needed. His goal wasn't truly Mexico. Deep down, he knew they might never make it that far. But he wanted to feel the air of freedom again, to stand under a sky not owned by wire. That morning, the men ate their breakfast in silence: cornmeal mush and a slice of bread. The camp loudspeaker played a faint country tune from the guardhouse, something by Bob Wills, and the smell of diesel mixed with dust as trucks idled near the gate. Bremer caught Hans's eye, and without speaking, both knew it was time. They were assigned to a crew of 12 POWs and 2 guards: Sergeant Wallace, a tall Mississippian with an easy grin, and Private Dean, a 19-year-old from Kansas who still wrote to his mother every week. The group loaded tools into the truck: hammers, wire cutters, shovels, and rumbled off down the dirt road, leaving behind the towers and watchful eyes. For the first hour, the work was ordinary. They repaired broken fence posts, hauled timber, and shared water from a canteen. The guards smoked and joked in the shade of a truck. Around noon, the air thickened with heat. Sweat rolled down necks, and flies swarmed near the salt rings on their shirts. Bremer saw his moment when Sergeant Wallace turned to check the truck's tires. "Now," he whispered in German. The three slipped away behind a cluster of pecan trees under the pretense of relieving themselves. They crouched low, crawling through knee-high grass, moving toward a dry creek bed that snaked westward. A hawk screeched above. When the whistle blew for return, only 9 men came back. At first, Wallace thought it was a miscount. "Check the tool rack," he said, thinking they'd just wandered off. But when he saw the footprints in the dust, his expression hardened. 3 missing. By the time the alarm siren wailed across Camp Hearn, Bramer and his companions were already half a mile away, hearts pounding, the sound of the siren echoing behind them like the memory of chains. They ran until their chests ached. The land unfolded endlessly, flat fields of dry grass, barbed fences, distant ranch houses shimmering in heat haze. No forests, no hills, nowhere to hide. But for the first time in months, they were free, or at least they believed they were. That first night they reached an abandoned barn near a creek. The water was muddy, but they drank greedily, ignoring the taste. They tore strips from their shirts to wrap blistered feet. Otto's hands shook as he whispered, "We're in America, but it feels like another planet." Carl managed a small smile. "Then we are explorers." In the camp, chaos reigned. Major Turner's men scoured the barracks for clues. Patrols were dispatched with jeeps and bloodhounds. The War Department in Washington was notified. Any escape, however small, was politically sensitive. Newspapers in nearby towns like Bryan and College Station picked up the rumor: 3 Germans loose near Hearn. But while soldiers planned roadblocks, another group quietly prepared to search: the Texas ranchers. That evening, word reached Tom "Buck" Rawlins, a wiry rancher with weathered skin and eyes sharp as rifle sights. Buck was no stranger to the army. His younger brother was fighting in Italy. When he heard that 3 German POWs had escaped, he laughed softly. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, slapping dust off his hat. "They'll find out real soon this ain't Europe." Buck and 2 other cowboys, Earl Thompson and Cal Whitaker, saddled their horses at dawn, rifles slung across their backs, and rode toward the creek lines west of the camp. "Army boys'll be looking on the roads," Buck said. "But those Krauts ain't stupid. They'll stick to the brush and waterbeds. We'll go where the soldiers can't." Back in the fields, the Germans trudged onward. The second day was merciless. The Texas sun turned the land into an oven, and heat waves blurred the horizon. Their canteens were nearly empty. They passed a rattlesnake coiled near a rock and froze, watching its tongue flick. Hans whispered, "This country doesn't want us here." By afternoon, Otto collapsed, his lips cracked, eyes dazed. "No more," he mumbled. Carl helped him up, fear gnawing at his stomach. The land stretched in all directions, indifferent and infinite. They followed a dirt track lined with mesquite trees, hoping it led to a town or a well. They didn't notice the faint trail of hoofprints forming behind them. Late that night, as the sky filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, Carl looked up and thought of home, of his wife Marta and the way she used to wait by the harbor with their son. He wondered if Bremen still stood, or if Allied bombs had turned it to ash. Hans, sitting nearby, whispered, "If we are caught, what do you think they'll do to us?" Carl stared into the dark. "I think," he said, "they'll treat us like men. They always have." He didn't know that. Just a few miles away, Buck Rawlins was crouched beside his horse, examining a set of boot prints near a dry creek. He touched the ground, felt the moisture, and said quietly, "They passed through here not 6 hours ago." The cowboys exchanged glances under the pale moon. The chase had begun, and somewhere in that vast silence of Texas night, the hunted and the hunters moved through the same land, guided by stars, heat, and something far older than war itself. The sun rose slow and merciless over the Texas plains, spilling its molten light across the fields and turning the world into a sheet of fire. Dust clung to everything: boots, shirts, hair, and even the air felt heavy enough to chew. The 3 Germans trudged along a narrow cattle trail that wound through mesquite and cactus, each step dragging more than the last. Their clothes were soaked with sweat and stiff with grime. Flies swarmed around them, buzzing in endless circles as if mocking their exhaustion. Carl Bramer wiped his forehead with a torn sleeve. His mouth was so dry his tongue felt like sandpaper. Beside him, Hans Kruger stumbled, muttering curses under his breath. Otto Keller lagged behind, every breath coming as a rasping wheeze. The mechanic's face was red with heat, his lips cracked and bleeding. "We must find water," he gasped. Carl nodded but said nothing. The map he'd drawn in his head meant little now. Everything looked the same: endless fields and fences, each one leading nowhere. They followed the faint glimmer of a mirage that shimmered like a lake on the horizon. When they reached it, it was only dust and shadows. Otto fell to his knees, clawing at the dry earth. Carl knelt beside him, despair flickering in his eyes. "Come," he whispered in German. "We can't stop." But Otto's head drooped. He whispered something about his wife, about airplanes and home, and then went silent. Hans pulled him up by the arm. "We didn't come this far to die in a field. They walked until the sun dropped low, the land burning red in its fading glow. They found a windmill silhouetted against the evening, old, rusted, its blades creaking. Below it, a cattle trough half filled with greenish water. The three men fell upon it without hesitation, drinking like beasts. The water tasted of algae and rust, but it was life. That night they slept in the shadow of the windmill. Coyotes howled somewhere far off, and the wind hissed through the dry grass. Carl lay awake, staring up at the stars. He had never seen stars like these, vast and sharp, spread across the black sky like shards of glass. He thought about the barbed wire of Camp Hearn, the orchestra that sometimes played old German songs at dusk, the prisoners who spoke of going home after the war as if that meant something. He thought about freedom, how close and yet how unreachable it felt. At dawn, the sound of distant engines woke them. A truck rattled down a dirt road to the east. Too far to see them, but close enough to remind them that the Americans were searching. Carl motioned for silence. The three crouched in the brush, watching the dust trail fade. When the sound was gone, Hans whispered, "We should keep to the woods." Carl nodded. They turned south, moving through low gullies and creek beds, careful to leave no clear footprints, but others were already tracking them. At a small army outpost outside Hearn, Lieutenant Robert Gaines studied a large map spread over his desk. "They can't have gone far," he muttered. "They're on foot, no supplies, no real sense of direction." His sergeant, a stocky man with a scar across his jaw, replied, "Sir, these Krauts are stubborn. They ain't stupid. We found boot prints heading west along Mill Creek." Gaines rubbed his chin. "That's ranch country. Hard to cover with trucks." He turned to one of his aides. "Tell the sheriff's office to spread word. If anyone spots strangers, blonde, sunburned, speaking funny, report immediately." By afternoon, the news had reached every farm and general store within 50 miles. The locals were curious, not frightened. To most Texans, the idea of 3 German soldiers wandering the plains seemed more like a story than a threat. But to the cowboys who lived on the land, it was a challenge. At the Rawlins Ranch, Buck saddled his horse before sunrise. "We'll start near Mill Creek," he told his companions, Earl and Cal. "That's where they'll head if they've got any sense at all. You can't last a day in this country without water." The men packed light, jerky, canteens, rope, and a single rifle each. They weren't bounty hunters or soldiers, just ranchers who knew every inch of this land. Buck's father had once tracked a wounded steer for 20 miles through a thunderstorm by reading broken grass. Buck had inherited that same patience, that same eye for small things. They rode out in silence, the sun climbing higher with each mile. By midday, Buck spotted faint impressions in the dirt, not horses, not cattle, boots. "They're heading south," he murmured. He dismounted, crouched, and brushed the dust with his fingers. Heavy prints, one's dragging his foot, maybe hurt or worn out. Earl spat into the dirt.
"How far, you reckon?"
6 hours, maybe less, Buck said. He stood, scanning the horizon. "If we keep a steady pace, we'll see smoke by dusk. These fellas will need a fire." The 3 cowboys rode on, dust trailing behind them like ghostly banners. The landscape stretched empty and endless. Broken fences, abandoned barns, thorny mesquite trees that reached toward the blazing sky. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk. As the day wore on, the German's condition worsened. Otto's steps grew slower, his breathing ragged. Hans took most of his weight, gritting his teeth with effort. "We can't go much farther," he muttered. Carl looked around. The land stretched flat, cruel, unforgiving. In Germany, the earth was green and soft. Here it was a furnace. They stopped beneath a cluster of oaks near a dry creek. Carl divided the last of their food, a few stale biscuits saved from camp rations. Otto could barely chew. "We can't stop," Carl said, though his voice was weak. "If we find a farmhouse, maybe they'll help us." Hans laughed bitterly. "Help us? Germans? Here?" He threw a pebble into the dust. "They'd hang us from a fence post." Carl said nothing. Deep down, he feared Hans was right. In the distance, a faint trail of dust rose, not from wind but from movement. The cowboys were closing in. By evening, the sky turned blood red, and the air cooled. The Germans reached an open field where cattle grazed lazily near a pond. The animals stared at them with mild curiosity. Carl motioned to the water, but Hans hesitated. "If there are cattle," he said, "there must be men nearby." Carl knew it too. He looked at Otto, who was barely conscious, and realized they had no choice. They knelt by the pond, cupped the water in their hands, and drank. Somewhere beyond the trees, a twig snapped. Buck Rollins motioned for silence. He'd seen the movement, 3 figures crouched by the pond, one slumped against a tree. He whispered to Cal, "There they are. Poor bastards look half dead." Cal lifted his rifle, but Buck pushed it down gently. "Easy, boy. We ain't shooting unless they make us." He stepped out from the brush, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. "Evenin', fellas," he called. His voice was calm, steady. "Y'all lost?" The Germans froze. Carl turned sharply, eyes wide. He didn't understand the words but caught the tone. Not hostile, not yet. Buck stopped 20 paces away, hands raised slightly. "Don't want trouble," he said slowly. "You boys thirsty?" Hans whispered. "Amerikaner." He reached for the stick lying beside him as if it were a weapon. Carl grabbed his arm. "No," he said softly. "No fight." Buck gestured toward his horse. "Got water and bread if you want it." The man hesitated. The cowboy's hat shaded his face, but his tone carried no anger, only quiet authority. Finally, Carl stepped forward, cautious as a wounded animal. Buck pulled a canteen from his saddle and held it out. "Here," he said. "Drink." Carl took it, lifted it to his lips, and drank deeply. The cool water felt like mercy. He handed it to Otto, who drank until he coughed. Buck nodded slowly. "Reckon you boys are the ones the army's looking for." Hans lowered his eyes. "We are soldiers," he said in broken English. "No gun." "Good," Buck replied. "Then we can skip the shooting part." He turned to Earl. "Right up to the highway, flag the MPs. Tell 'em we got their boys." As Earl rode off, Cal dismounted and offered bread from his saddlebag. Otto took it with trembling hands. Carl watched the cowboys in silence. Their sunburned faces, their dust-covered boots, the easy way they carried themselves. He realized they were nothing like the soldiers who had captured him in Tunisia or guarded him at Herne. These men moved with quiet confidence, as if the land itself obeyed them. "Why you help?" Carl asked haltingly. Buck shrugged. "Ain't helpin'. Just doing what's right. You're on Texas ground now. We don't leave folks to die out here, even Germans." The 3 sat beneath the trees sharing the cowboys' food. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars came out one by one. The night smelled of mesquite smoke and dust. Cal lit a small fire, the flames flickering softly against the dark. Carl stared into it, feeling something strange stir inside him: shame, gratitude, confusion. For months he had believed the Americans were all the same, victors, arrogant and indifferent. But these men treated him not as an enemy, but as another soul lost in the wilderness. When the military jeep finally arrived, its headlights slicing through the dark, the cowboy stood quietly. Buck tipped his hat to Lieutenant Gaines, who stepped out, surprise etched on his face. "You found them." Buck smiled faintly. "Didn't take much finding, Lieutenant. Texas did most of the work." The German stood, hands raised, weary but alive. Carl looked once more at Buck, who nodded. "You'll be all right now," he said simply. "War'll end soon enough. Till then, keep your head down." Carl wanted to reply, to say something about decency, about honor, about how strange it felt to be captured by men with ropes instead of rifles. But the words caught in his throat. He only managed a quiet dank. As the jeep drove them back toward Camp Herne, Carl looked out at the vast moonlit plains, the same fields he had crossed in fear and exhaustion. Now they looked different, softer somehow, touched by a quiet grace he couldn't explain. Behind them, Buck and his men rode home in silence, their silhouettes fading into the darkness, swallowed by the land they knew so well. The morning light crept over the horizon with the slow calm that only Texas could offer, gilding the prairie grass in gold and bathing the air in warmth. The army truck jolted along the dirt road, carrying the 3 captured Germans back toward Camp Herne. Inside, the soldiers sat on the benches along the sides of the truck bed. Karl Bremer, Hans Kruger and Otto Keller, their wrists bound loosely, dust clinging to their faces and clothes. The rhythmic rattle of the engine filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional cough or sigh. Lieutenant Robert Gaines rode in the front, his hat tilted low to block the sun. Every few minutes he glanced in the mirror to check on the prisoners. He saw 3 men broken more by exhaustion than by defeat. They were thinner than the reports described, their skin sunburned, eyes hollowed by days of running. Gaines felt no anger toward them. In another life, he thought, they might have been just ordinary men working farms or fixing machines. Carl sat quietly, staring at the endless stretch of land rolling past. He recognized the faint silhouette of the windmill they had slept under 2 nights before, the same one where Otto nearly fainted from thirst. That place already felt like a lifetime ago. The memory of Buck Rollins handing him water still lingered in his mind. The calm voice, the sun in the cowboy's eyes, the way he said, "We don't leave folks to die out here." It wasn't something a soldier would say. It was something a man who understood suffering would. Hans leaned forward, his voice low. "You think they'll punish us?" he asked in German. Carl shook his head. "Not severely. The Americans don't waste anger. They'll write their reports, maybe confine us for a while, but they won't hurt us." Otto, pale and trembling, murmured. Then it was for nothing. His eyes were half closed, his voice barely audible. All that walking, all that heat, for nothing. Carl didn't answer. Somewhere deep down he knew Otto was right, but he also knew that the attempt itself had meant something, perhaps the last gesture of pride, of the need to prove they were still men capable of choice. When the truck finally rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn, the guards at the watchtowers looked down with a mix of relief and curiosity. The prisoners inside the camp stopped their chores, shading their eyes from the sun as they watched the returning escapee. Some muttered words of admiration, others shook their head. The truck stopped near the command building. Major Harold Turner stepped out, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. Gaines saluted. "We found them near Mill Creek, sir. Ranchers caught them before we did." Turner raised an eyebrow. "Cowboys?" "Yes, sir," Gaines said. "They were tracking them since dawn. No resistance, no casualties." The major looked at the Germans, his gaze sharp but not cruel. "You men caused quite a stir," he said. "The War Department thought we had another Papago situation on our hands." Carl didn't understand the words, but the tone carried authority. Turner turned to Gaines. "Feed them. Let the medic look them over, then solitary for 3 days. After that, back to regular quarters." "Yes." As the Americans led them away, Carl felt the strange mixture of shame and relief that came with returning alive from failure. The camp looked unchanged. Same fences, same dust, same distant smell of cooking beans from the kitchen area. Yet it felt different now. The barbed wire no longer looked like a prison, but a kind of safety. Inside the infirmary, a nurse cleaned Otto's cracked lips and wrapped a bandage around his blistered feet. Hans lay on a cot, his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. "They treat us better than our officers ever did," he muttered. "Back home we'd have been court-martialed." Carl watched the nurse move methodically, her face focused, kind but distant. "The Americans don't hate us," he said softly. "They don't need to. They've already won." For the next 3 days, the 3 Germans stayed in solitary confinement, not as punishment but as procedure. Each cell had a small cot, a thin mattress, and a barred window that looked out at nothing but open sky. Carl spent hours lying awake, replaying everything in his mind: the dash through the fields, the dry wind cutting through his throat, the sound of hooves approaching, Buck Rollins' calm voice offering bread and water. He thought of what it meant to lose. Not just the war, but the image of strength he had carried all his life. As an engineer, he had built machines meant to outlast men. But here, in this foreign land, far from the roar of cities and the noise of ideology, all those machines meant nothing. The cowboy's quiet decency had dismantled every belief he'd built brick by brick. On the 4th morning, a guard came to escort them back to the main barracks. As Carl stepped out into the sunlight, the warmth felt different. The men in his block greeted him with cautious smiles. Some clapped him on the shoulder. Others whispered questions about how far they'd gotten, whether they'd seen any towns, any chance of real escape. Carl simply said, "The land is too big, bigger than courage." Days turned into weeks. Life in the camp resumed its rhythm. Prisoners tended gardens, played soccer, and traded handmade crafts with guards for cigarettes. American officers occasionally brought local children to see the camp's theater performances, staged by the Germans themselves. The war still raged across Europe, but here in Texas it felt like another planet. Carl resumed work in the camp's carpentry shop. His hands, though still raw, found comfort in the smell of wood and the sound of chisels. He carved a small horse from a block of cedar, its pose strong and still, its head lowered as if tired. He placed it on the windowsill beside his bunk. One afternoon, as he planed a piece of wood, Lieutenant Gaines entered the shop with a folded envelope in his hand. "Bramer," he said, "I have something for you." Carl turned, puzzled. Gaines handed him the envelope. A note came in with a delivery from town. "Thought you'd like to see it." Inside was a small piece of paper, creased and smudged. The handwriting was rough, in English, but Carl could make out the words, "Glad you boys made it back safe. Texas isn't kind to runaways. When this war's over, I hope you see a sky that doesn't have fences. Buck Rollins. For a long moment, Carl just stared at the note. Then he smiled faintly, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his pocket. That night he sat outside the barracks after lights out, watching the stars. Hans joined him, sitting on the steps with a cigarette stolen from a guard. "You're quiet these days," Hans said. Carl exhaled slowly. "Do you ever think about what happens when this ends?" Hans shrugged. "If I live, I'll go home. Farm, drink beer, maybe forget the rest." Carl nodded. "I used to think that too. But after that night out there," he paused, his eyes distant, "I realized something. Those men, the cowboys, they live as if freedom is just breathing. For us, freedom was always about fighting, proving, taking. For them, it's just being."
Hans chuckled softly.
"You sound like a philosopher." "Maybe hunger does that," Carl said with a faint smile. The next day, Major Turner called the three escapees to his office. He looked at them sternly but without malice. "Gentlemen," he said, "you gave my men a long week, but you also reminded us to never underestimate our guests." He glanced at a file on his desk. "According to protocol, I should send a full report to Washington, but I'll recommend leniency. You've shown discipline in the camp since your return. Keep it that way." Carl saluted instinctively, though he wasn't required to. Turner nodded once, almost approvingly. "That's all, gentlemen." As they stepped outside, the sound of laughter carried from the soccer field. A group of German prisoners played a match against American guards, both sides shouting and cheering in friendly rivalry. For a moment Carl watched, struck by the absurd normalcy of it. Enemies kicking a ball beneath a wide Texas sky while a war burned continents away. Weeks later, autumn arrived. The air cooled, and cotton fields turned golden. Local ranchers hired POW laborers to help with harvests under supervision. One morning, Carl's name appeared on the work roster for the Rollins Ranch. When the truck dropped them off, he saw Buck waiting near a fence, leaning against his horse, hat pulled low. The cowboy smiled faintly. "Didn't think I'd see you again this soon," he said. Carl stepped down, unsure what to say. "We work here?" Buck nodded. "For a few weeks. Cotton's due. You behave, you'll get paid in shits. Coffee too, if you're lucky." Carl's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Coffee," he repeated softly, almost reverently. The work was hard, but it felt honest. The Germans picked cotton under the hot sun, sweating through their shirts. Buck and his men rode among them, keeping an easy watch. There was no hostility, just the rhythm of labor, the crackle of dry stalks, and the creak of leather saddles. One afternoon, Carl and Buck found themselves repairing a broken fence together. The cowboy squatted beside him, hammering a nail into a post. "So, Carl," Buck said casually, "you still think you can outrun Texas?" Carl chuckled quietly. "No," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I think Texas outran me." Buck grinned. "Smart man." They worked in silence after that, the wind carrying the faint scent of hay and dust. When the sun dipped low, turning the sky the color of embers, Buck handed Carl a tin cup of real coffee, dark, steaming, strong. Carl held it with both hands, the warmth seeping into his palms. "Danke," he murmured. "Don't thank me," Buck said with a smile. "Thank the beans." The simple moment felt profound. A shared drink between men once divided by war and language, now just workers under the same fading light. When the harvest ended and the POWs were taken back to camp, Carl looked back once at the ranch. Buck raised his hand in a small wave, and Carl returned it. For the first time in years he felt something like peace stir inside him. The war might still be raging across oceans, but here in Texas, for a brief moment, enemies had shared the same earth, the same sky, the same breath of humanity that no uniform could erase. Winter came slowly to Texas in 1944, slipping into the land without warning, softening the air but never quite chilling it. The cotton fields near Hearn lay bare, the wind carrying the scent of dried earth and wood smoke. Inside Camp Hearn the rhythms of life continued. The same bugle at dawn, the same rattle of the mess hall trays, the same distant hum of trains carrying supplies south toward Houston. For most of the German prisoners, the war had become something far away, a fading noise that belonged to another life. But for Carl Bramer, the quiet of Texas carried a strange kind of meaning he could not shape. He had returned to his duties in the carpentry shed, shaping planks for camp furniture and small boxes for storage. Every now and then he would catch sight of the paper note that Buck Rawlins had sent him, folded neatly under a tin cup by his bunk. "I hope you see a sky that doesn't have fences." The words stayed with him like a song that refused to fade. He thought often of that morning when the Cowboys had appeared through the dust, not as enemies but as men, free, calm, unafraid. He had dreamed all his life of freedom, but only in that moment had he truly understood what it meant. Rumors spread through the camp that the war in Europe was turning against Germany. In the mess hall, some men still spoke proudly of the fatherland, insisting that new weapons would turn the tide. Others stayed silent, eyes hollow, knowing deep down the end was coming. At night, when the guards turned out the lights, voices drifted through the barracks, whispers of cities burned to the ground, of families lost under the bombs, of letters that no longer came. Carl had stopped hoping for mail months ago. He didn't even know if Bremen still stood. One evening in January 1945, Lieutenant Gaines entered the camp's recreation hall, carrying a bundle of newspapers. He placed them on a table and said, "They've crossed the Rhine." The Germans froze mid-conversation. Some stood, some refused to move. Carl walked slowly to the table and picked up a copy of the Bryan Eagle. There, in black letters across the front page, was the headline, "Allied Forces Advance into Germany." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Hans muttered, "It's over." Carl folded the paper carefully, his jaw tight. "Not yet," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Weeks later, news of Hitler's death reached them. The camp fell silent that night. No songs, no laughter, only the crackling of the Texas wind against the barracks walls. For some, it was disbelief. For others, relief. Carl sat alone outside the carpentry shed staring at the stars. They looked the same as they always had. Distant, cold, eternal. But he felt something shift inside him. For years, everything had been built around that war, that cause. Now it was gone. In May, the guards announced the surrender. The war in Europe had officially ended. The German prisoners gathered in stunned quiet, listening as Major Turner read the official statement. There were no cheers, no tears, only silence. The heavy silence of men who had given everything to a dream that had turned to dust. Turner looked at them with something almost like sympathy. "Gentlemen," he said, "the war is over. You will be repatriated in due time. Till then, you remain under our care." The men drifted back to their quarters in a daze. Some wept quietly into their hands. Others stared at the ground, unable to speak. Hans sat on his bunk, shaking his head. "What now?" he asked. Carl didn't answer. He simply looked through the window at the barbed wire glinting in the sunlight. For the first time, it didn't look like a prison. It looked like protection from a world that no longer existed. In the following months, Camp Hearn became quieter. The guards loosened their rules. Prisoners were allowed to write more letters, to visit local ranches for work details without heavy escort. American soldiers treated them with an ease that seemed almost brotherly. Many locals in nearby towns began to see them not as enemies, but as young men far from home, broken and bewildered. Children waved as POW trucks passed down dirt roads. Farmers shared watermelons and cold drinks at the end of long workdays. Carl found himself assigned once more to Buck Rawlins's ranch for a few weeks of post-harvest repair work. When he stepped off the truck, Buck was waiting by the corral, hat tipped low, a cigarette between his fingers. "Well, look who's back," Buck said, smiling. "Heard the big news. Guess y'all don't got a Führer anymore." Carl gave a faint nod. "No," he said in careful English. "No Führer. Only people now." Buck studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "People's a good start." The work was peaceful. Mending fences, cleaning stables, helping load hay into the barn. The air was cooler now, the Texas sky soft and wide. In the evenings, Buck would bring out his guitar and play old songs, while the POWs sat nearby, quiet, listening. Sometimes he'd hand Carl a cup of coffee and they'd share a silence that said more than words ever could. One night, as the sun sank behind the hills, Buck looked out toward the horizon. "You ever think about staying here after all this?" he asked. Carl smiled faintly. "A German? Here?" Buck shrugged. "Stranger things have happened. This land's seen worse than war, seen men from all over start again." Carl looked at the vast emptiness stretching out before them. "In Germany," he said softly, "the sky is smaller. Here it never ends." When the work detail ended, the Germans loaded back onto the truck. Buck shook Carl's hand, firm and steady. "Take care of yourself, Carl Bramer," he said. "Maybe one day we'll meet again, somewhere with no fences." Carl nodded, unable to find words. The truck pulled away, and Buck's figure grew smaller in the rear view until he was just a shadow against the orange sky. In the camp, time stretched quietly. News came that repatriations would begin soon. Some men cheered, eager to go home. Others feared what home meant now: ruins, hunger, absence. When the first group left by train, the rest lined up by the fence, waving until the cars disappeared into the distance. The camp began to feel emptier, the noise fading day by day. Carl spent his final week carving small wooden horses as gifts for the American guards who had treated them kindly. One he carved especially for Buck, a proud standing stallion with its head lifted toward the wind. On its side he etched a single word in German: Freiheit. Freedom. He gave it to Lieutenant Gaines to mail to the Rawlins ranch. On his last night, Carl walked to the far fence alone. The wind was warm, carrying the smell of rain. Beyond the wire he could see the faint lights of Hearn twinkling in the dark. Somewhere out there were cowboys sitting by their fires, perhaps Buck among them, sipping coffee and listening to the night sounds. Carl closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't an enemy. He was just a man alive, standing under a wide sky that belonged to no one and everyone. When morning came, trucks lined up outside the gate, their engines idling softly. The German prisoners gathered with their few belongings: small bags, carvings, photographs, folded letters. Major Turner stood near the exit, clipboard in hand, his expression firm but kind. "Good luck, men," he said as each passed. "May you find peace where you're going." Carl shook the major's hand. "Thank you, sir." Turner nodded. "Safe travels, Bremer." The truck rumbled down the dusty road, past the fields and the creeks, past the ranches where they had once worked and almost escaped. The sky was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds. Hans sat beside Carl, staring out at the horizon. "I don't know what waits for us there," Hans said. Carl looked at him. "Maybe that's the point," he said quietly. Their journey took them through Galveston, where ships waited to carry them back across the Atlantic. At the port, American soldiers stood in neat lines, saluting as the prisoners boarded. There was no anger, no pride, only the quiet recognition that the war was finally done. Carl stood on the deck as the ship pulled away, watching the coastline fade. The air smelled of salt and freedom. He thought of the last cup of coffee, the handshake, the note under his cup back in the barracks. Weeks later he stepped onto German soil again. A land scarred, quiet, hollow. The streets of Bremen were rubble, the river filled with wreckage, the sky gray with smoke. He found his home gone, his family scattered, but he found work again, repairing engines for a factory that rose from the ruins. Each night he would take out Buck's note and place it on his desk beside a small photograph of Texas plains he'd managed to get printed from memory. Years passed. Germany healed, slowly, painfully. Carl grew older, his hair turning silver, his hands rough but steady. One spring morning, he received a letter postmarked from Texas. Inside was a photograph, a sepia image of a lone horse under a wide open sky. On the back, in familiar handwriting, were a few words: "Still no fences here. Hope it's the same where you are." Carl smiled, set the photograph against the window, and looked out at the pale northern light spilling across his workshop. He no longer needed to run to feel free. Freedom, he had learned, was not escape. It was the quiet dignity of living without hatred. That night, as he locked up his shop and stepped into the cool evening air, he paused to watch the sunset fade beyond the rooftops. For a brief moment the light reminded him of Texas, the endless plains, the rusted windmill, the cowboys riding through dust with calm certainty. Somewhere in his heart he heard the sound of hooves again, faint and far away, like an echo of something eternal. And though the war had ended long ago, its strangest truth remained alive in him, that sometimes the men who catch you are the ones who set you free.